Today we'll be doing a deep dive into the Phaser 3 Loader plugin. The Phaser 3 Loader plugin is one of the common key components in any Phaser 3 game, and this class is responsible for loading all the external assets in parallel and for caching those files for use throughout your game. So in most Phaser 3 examples, we typically see some type of preload function or method on a Phaser scene class that loads some type of file. Like in this example here, we're loading in an image. And so we'll usually see code like this.load and then whatever type of file that we want to load, along with the configuration information for that file. So typically this will be some type of key for when we want to go ahead and cache that asset, and we can reference it later in our code with the path to where that file is actually located. And then maybe other configuration, like if it's a sprite sheet, how Phaser should go ahead and cut that image up into individual sprites. And so what this code is actually doing, it's referencing our Phaser 3 Loader plugin. And the reason this works is that our plugin is available to all of our Phaser scenes, and each scene has its own instance of that loader. So one of the really great benefits of using the built-in loader is that Phaser will automatically create a cache of these assets and textures when they're loaded into your game. And so this is really powerful, since this will allow you to create multiple scenes in your game and reuse your game assets across them, but you only need to load those assets one time. And so due to this, you can easily do things like create a simple loading scene where you can load all the assets that you need for your game before you actually transition to another scene in your game, like your title scene or your main game logic. Like other objects in Phaser 3, the loader plugin also emits a number of events that can be listened for. And so those events will include details when a file is loaded, when all of your files are loaded, and when a single file is loaded, it'll provide details on that file. And so with these events, this can allow you to do things like create a loading bar that updates as files is loaded, like this example here. And so what we could do is in a scene, we could go ahead and keep track of if we loaded in all of our assets, and if we have, we could update a progress bar. And that way the player knows how long until the game actually is ready. And so this works really well for the games that have a small number of assets and the total size of those assets is very small. However, if you need to load a large amount of assets, or if the files are very large, you can end up driving your players away before they even start playing your game. And so in those scenarios, you would typically want to load the bare minimum assets you need to start your game, and then either load the rest of your assets in the background or when you need them in your game. And this is possible with the built-in loader, but there are a few things you need to do in order to get the loader to load the files and to know when your files are actually ready so you can actually use them in your code. And so by default, when we go ahead and reference our loader in our preload method, what Phaser is going to do is it's automatically going to handle loading all those assets for us. And so we don't actually have to start the loader. It does it automatically. And once that queue is finished from all the files that were added, it will go ahead and transition to your create state inside your scene. And so it'll fire your create method, and then you can actually start running your game logic. And if you try to attempt to load these files outside of your preload method, it won't actually work. You need to kick this process off manually. So like in this example here, if I go ahead and copy this, let's go ahead and just comment that out. We're going to go ahead and paste it here. And if we try running our code, what we'll see is we have a broken image. And what happens is we've added this image to our loader, but nothing actually triggered it to start loading that asset. And now when we go to create our game object, our image isn't inside our cache. And so that's why we have this broken image here, because we have nothing to actually display. And so to go ahead and fix this, we'd actually have to go ahead and start our loader manually and then wait for the files to be loaded before we create our game object. And so to see an example of how to do this, we're going to go ahead and start by taking a look at how the loader actually functions in the preload method, and we'll see how we can listen for those events when the files are loaded. In this example here, we are loading in one asset in our preload method, which then we use in our create method to go ahead and create an image game object. And that results in this background image here. And so by default, when we use this.load, what this does is our loader plugin is going to go ahead and add this file to a queue. And what's unique about our preload method is Phaser is going to go ahead and process that queue for us automatically. And so what Phaser is going to do, it's going to wait until all these files in the queue are loaded. And once they are, then it's going to go ahead and trigger our create lifecycle event so we can actually start our create method in our scene. And so to know when these files are actually loaded, we can actually listen for events, and we can mimic that same functionality inside our create method. And so there are a number of events that are emitted And so to take a look at a few of them, what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to uncomment some code here. And so when our scene refreshes, we're going to see some console log statements. And so our first event that we can listen for is going to be our loader complete event. And this event will be fired once Phaser has finished processing the current queue in the loader plugin. And this is important because you can go ahead and add more files to your queue. And once that queue is emptied, this event gets fired. But then if you add in more files and you start that process, this is going to fire multiple times. Another event we can listen for is the file complete event. And what this event does is anytime a single file has been processed in the queue and is fully loaded, what it's going to do is in this event, we're going to receive some metadata about that file. And so what we'll get is we'll get the cache key of the key that we provided when we loaded in that file. So like background, we can see that's provided here. We get the type of file that was loaded, and then we actually get the raw data, the raw file data that's tied to it. And so we get like this image source here. And so what's unique about the file complete event is this is going to fire every single time that we load in a new file. And so if we want to listen for a specific event tied to a specific file, there is an event for that. And that's our file key complete event. What this event does is we can combine the file complete prefix with the type of file that we want to track, so image in our case, and then with a dash, and then the cache key that we provided, so this key here, when we did our list.load. And so by creating this key here, this combination, it allows us to listen for when that single file is loaded. And we'll receive the same type of metadata that we do in this callback here. And so just to see an example, I'm going to change this to background 2. That's going to break a few things, but what we'll see now is in our callbacks, we'll see our file complete worked because we're listening for any file that gets loaded, but because we changed that key name, this event never actually fires, and so our callback never gets invoked. And so if we change this to background 2, now we'll see in our console log, we have that callback working properly. And so how our loader plugin actually works is anytime we add a new file that we want to load, Phaser will add this file to the loader queue. And how that queue works is anytime we add a new file, it's going to place this file on a property that's called our list, which is a set for this loader. And so to see an example, what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm just going to do a console log, and I'm just going to log out our loader plugin. And so on our loader plugin, we have a number of properties, and a few of these are key to the queue of how files are actually loaded. The first one is list, and so this is going to be a set. And this is just going to be the list of files that the Phaser loader plugin needs to process. Once Phaser starts to process that, it's going to move it from this list set here to another property called InFlight. And so InFlight is another set, and this is while Phaser is actually trying to process that file and do something with it. Finally, if everything works properly, it's going to move it from the set here to a new property called queue. And this is another set, and so this queue is basically means, hey, we finished loading our file, we have the raw data, and then there's going to be additional processing done to it. A good example of this is like when we load in a sprite sheet, we need the raw image data first before we can break up that image into sprites because we just slice the image to know what to show to the player. That would happen in the additional processing. And so just to see an example, what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to go ahead and revert back this code. I'm going to go ahead and do our console log, and actually let me uncomment this. And so what we're going to see now in our log is before we actually add in our image here, we can see our list, our set is empty. And then after we add in our image to our loader, we can now see that we have one entry inside that set. And now Phaser is going to go ahead and do that process and load in all those files for us. So now that we know how our events works, we're going to go ahead and try loading in an asset from our create method. So down in our create method, we have some commented out code. And so what we're going to go ahead and do is let's go ahead and load in our image. All right, and then after that, what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to go ahead and console log out our list from our loader. So I'm just going to copy that line here, and we're going to go ahead and paste it. And so now, if we're going to take a look, what we'll see is now we have a new item in our queue. And so what we need to do is we need to tell Phaser to go ahead and start loading in our file, so then that way we have that available to us. And to do that, we just need to go ahead and reference this.load and then call the start method. And what that's going to do is that's going to restart our queue. And then that way Phaser will go ahead and start loading in any new files that have been added to that queue. And so what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to uncomment this code here. And basically what this code does is this is just some more event listening like we did up at our preload method. And so we're just going to go ahead and listen for our file complete event so we know when a file is loaded. And then similarly, we're just going to listen for our file complete event so we know which file was actually loaded. And so now if we go ahead and save and refresh our scene, what we'll see now is after our queue is started, we get our event that, hey, we finished loading in our files, and now we can go ahead and create our ship game object. All right, and so just by adding in this load.start, this is going to tell the Phaser loader plugin to go ahead and start loading in that files from our queue. And so one thing to keep in mind is we can also add files to our queue at any time. And if the queue is not finished, Phaser is also going to go ahead and load in those files. So as an example, if I go ahead and try loading the second file here, and we go ahead and save, what we're going to go ahead and see now is in our events, we're going to only get our complete event one time because we waited until both those files were loaded, and now we go ahead and create our game object. But then for our file complete event handler, we can see that, hey, we loaded in these two files. And so this is important because once our queue is finished, as we saw, if we try to add in a new file to that queue, Phaser is not going to load it, and we need to call that start method again. And so what I'm going to do real quick is I'm going to go ahead and wrap our code here before we add this file to our queue in a this time delayed call. And basically what this does is this just adds an event where we're going to wait so many milliseconds before we invoke the code in the callback here. And then what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm just going to bump this up to 500 milliseconds. And now what's going to happen is in our callbacks, we're going to go ahead and see that we load in our ship image, and we can see that our queue is now emptied because we finished all that before this was actually added to our queue. And so now what we need to do is we actually need to go ahead and restart our queue again. So we're going to call this load.start. And so this is good to know because we can call this method as many times as we need to, and we can have Phaser load in files at any point in our scene lifecycle. And so now what we'll see is we call our file loading is completed. We now load in our rock image after that's done, and now we get another file loading is completed. And so this is important because let's say up in our completed event here, we actually wanted to go ahead and create our rock game object. So now if we go ahead and switch this, what's going to go ahead and happen is because we base this on just the complete event, we can see the first time our scene loads, we have a broken image, but then once we have that texture available, this gets updated, our game object to have the appropriate texture that we need. So it's something to keep in mind if you're going to use that complete event handler. You want to make sure you only create the game objects that you know you have your files for, or only make them visible once the file's loaded. Alright, with that brings this video to an end. So as a reminder, there's a link in the description of the video to the complete source code for this video, and as always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content. If you did enjoy the video, please consider liking the video and hitting the bell icon to be notified when the next video is released. For more great Phaser 3 content, please see the links on your screen now.